About 20% of the nation's energy is nuclear energy right now. I'm Myrriah Gómez. I was born and raised in the Pojoaque Valley in the community of El Rancho, which is about a 15-minute drive off the hill of Los Alamos. I started to think about nuclear issues really differently when I was in college. I happened to be home one weekend and my uncle had come over to talk to my dad about signing paperwork for a class action lawsuit. And I had either never heard or never paid attention to the fact that my great-grandparents had a ranch atop the Pajarito Plateau, and they were one of the families who were evicted from their ranch when the Manhattan Project came in the 1940s, 1942 actually. In 1945, or right after the scientists in Los Alamos in particular had actually created the bomb, they needed a place to test the plutonium bomb. So they knew the uranium bomb would work, they needed a place to test the plutonium bomb. And so in a similar effort of needing to find a site, locate a site, they chose the Hornada del Muerto, an area in the Tularosa Basin in central New Mexico, to test the bomb. So on July 16th, 1945, that test took place. So because the weather was not ideal and the conditions were not ideal to what they needed, which was very specific, they still tested it. The fallout from that test was so immense that it caused radiation-induced cancers and other illnesses across the Tularosa Basin. Most of those communities were Nuevomexicanos, Spanish-speaking New Mexicans, and to this day, they have been impacted by the legacy of that test. The Radiation Exposure Compensation Act was a piece of legislation that was originally passed by Congress in the year 1990. And the initial purpose of the law is to compensate people from the nuclear industry. But the way that the law is written, and it was amended in the year 2000, and it still doesn't include anyone else other than the Nevada test site participants. So there were over 900 atmospheric nuclear tests conducted at the Nevada test site during the height of atomic testing. And so the Nevada test site downwinders, mostly Anglo communities, are eligible for compensation under RECA. It does not include the Trinity downwinders, and it does not include downwinders in the Marshall Islands and Pacific Islands. So we know that, for instance, Bikini Atoll and the Marshall Islands were heavily impacted. I mean, like, talk about generational trauma and nuclear colonialism by atmospheric tests, but they're also not included in the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. One of the tenets of nuclear colonialism is intergenerational trauma. And one of the parts of intergenerational trauma is the way that genes are changed and the way that cancer-causing genes are passed down through generations. Indigenous people, Indigenous women in particular, who've been so heavily impacted by the nuclear industry, like the standards aren't even set for thinking about how ionizing radiation affects them, affects their offspring, affects their children. There's over 80,000 tons of high-level nuclear waste being stored above ground in cooling facilities near nuclear reactors. The country has no long-term plan for how to store this high-level nuclear waste. And they're trying to bring nuclear waste into New Mexico to store as a, quote, interim facility, which becomes a de facto permanent nuclear waste facility. Like, there's still drums of contamination, of waste that are buried along the Rio Grande and in nearby areas, and they want to bring high-level nuclear waste. So this is environmental racism. Many people have been working for several years to keep this facility out of New Mexico. We already have the waste isolation pilot plant in southern New Mexico, which stores transuranic waste, most of which comes from Los Alamos. So you want to start producing more nuclear waste and bringing nuclear waste to New Mexico, fix the waste that's already here. Amend RECA and include the downwinders. And New Mexico in particular has never received a public apology from the federal government to apologize for testing a plutonium bomb in their backyard. in their community. Environmental racism continues in New Mexico in a lot of different capacities. Because New Mexico has one of the largest populations, it has the largest populations of what the government considers Hispanic people. It has the largest population of what the government considers Native American indigenous people. Because of our populations alone, we are targeted, disproportionately targeted for polluting industries. We have a whole 2.5 square miles of mixed waste open pit landfill here in Albuquerque, which nobody talks about. We have the largest arsenal of nuclear weapons in Albuquerque, which nobody talks about. Literally, if New Mexico seceded from the United States, we'd be the third largest nuclear weapons wielding country in the world. One of the major examples to think about the risks that we're taking by continuing the nuclear industrial complex in New Mexico and the intersections with climate change is that we've seen the devastation of fires that have started and happened as a result of climate change. And we've also seen how close they've come to mixing really badly with nuclear weapons complexes. In the year 2000, the Cerro Grande fire burned in Los Alamos. I remember being at the state track meet, and I remember my high school boyfriend's dad, who was a firefighter in Los Alamos. I remember him coming to my high school cross-country coach and telling him, "Your house just burned down." You know, the way that that fire hit close to home, not just, I think there were like 400 people who lost their homes, but also how close they came. We were terrified that it was going to release all kinds of contamination or waste into the atmosphere. All the firefighters from these nearby communities in particular who were coming home and washing their clothes they'd come home and their family, their wives in particular, were washing their clothes. And I know about a family in Truchas, New Mexico, who this happened to, and then family members got sick because of whatever contamination they had brought home. You know, climate change and the intersections of climate change and the nuclear legacy are so much more than what we see at the surface. It is this entire intersectional conversation about race, about class, about ethnicity that we're really not even talking about right now. We have to get legacy waste out of New Mexico. We have to push for these Superfund sites to get cleaned up. We have to prevent high-level nuclear waste from coming into New Mexico. We have to put pressure for more regulations to be set at Los Alamos. We can't let WIPP build a new facility, a new compartment at the WIPP site. I guess what gives me hope is the fact that I'm now an ancestor, and I don't want my kids to grow up in an environment in New Mexico that has been so polluted that there's no turning back. I tell my students, contrary what people might think, I'm not against, having nuclear science and nuclear engineering at college campuses. We need people we need you to be a nuclear engineer. Somebody has to figure out what to do with this waste. Somebody has to figure out how to clean up this waste. So, I think that there is hope through education, through younger generations, through coalitional work, that we can put an end to this period of nuclear colonialism.